So last week we discussed the era of the destruction of the second temple, and now we're moving on to the next generation. Some of the key figures of this era are some of the key figures that some of the most prominent names that most of us may already know, such as Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Meir, the student of Rabbi Akiva, right? So we're starting off with the destruction. Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, right? We said there was many Rabban Gamliels. There was Rabban Gamliel and then Rabban Shimon, and then Rabban Gamliel ben Shimon, and then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and it went on for a couple of generations like this. So this is the one we refer to as Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, the elder, the son of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Rashbag. That's what they, if you ever hear Rashbag, it's always referring to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, HaNeherag B'tzara, the one who, we said he was killed by Titus, when Titus conquered Jerusalem and burned down the city and the temple. Right, so his son is known as Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. He was Ayarosh Yeshiva Venasi Ahar Petirat Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. He is the one who succeeded Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai as the president of the Supreme Court. And his brother-in-law, Ubala Hoto, Hayar Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus. Right, this Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus is someone who we've discussed before. Anybody remember? A famous story that we studied of Tanurosh and Achnai, right? The oven of Achnai, of a boa constrictor. If you remember that class, the star of that class was Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus. He is one of the greatest of the Tanaim, right? Of the Hachamim in the times of the Mishnah. He has his own midrashic literature, which is considered to be fantastic midrashic literature. One could also say some bizarre midrashim. His focus there was on Maaseh Bereshit, the creation of the world, and Maaseh Merkava, we'll call it the metaphysical world. And he is, could say, the spiritual grandfather of the well-known Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because he is the teacher of Rabbi Akiva, and the student of Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he was the brother-in-law of Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. V'haverav and his friends, right, people of his generations, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, Acham Gadol ve'Av Bedin, right? He was also, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah was also a great scholar in his time, and he was like, he wasn't the president of the court, he was like the deputy of the court. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, another one of those Hachamim was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was also Kohen. He was a priest, 10th generation to Ezra HaSofer, right? Kohen Asiri le Ezra, 10th generation of Kohanim from Ezra. We say Ezra HaSofer was also a Kohen, and he was also the high priest in the second temple at the beginning. Ve'ashir Gadol, he was also very, very wealthy. Ve'Rabbi Hanafta, Ve'Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, Kol ele dor ehadhim. Right, all of these Hachamim, a lot of them are mentioned many times in the Mishnah and also in the Talmud are quoted. These are all part of one generation, the same generation. Okay, this in Sefer HaKabbalah. Now we're moving on to Maimonides. In the Mishneh Torah, it says, Hamisha Talmidim hayu lo leRabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai had we call 5 main students, 5 disciples that studied directly from him. והם גדולי החכמים שקיבלו ממנו. These are, and he's specifying, these aren't the only ones, right, that were his students. But among all of his students, there were 5 disciples that studied directly from him, and they were the greatest. Ribbi Eliezer HaGadol, right, who we mentioned before. Ribbi Yoshua, Ribbi Yosef HaKohen, Ribbi Shimon ben Netanel, Ribbi Elazar ben Arach. All right, these are his main students. And the next generation of students after them is Ribbi Akiva ben Yosef, Kibel mi Ribbi Eliezer HaGadol. Right, so we said this great giant Tana Ribbi Eliezer HaGadol is even referred to as the great Ribbi Eliezer. His main student was Ribbi Akiva, right? Also here mentioned as Akiva ben Yosef, the Yosef Aviv Ger Sedek Haya, and his father Yosef, he was a convert as well. Ribbi Ishmael, Ribbi Meir, right? These are 2 of the main students of Ribbi Akiva, right? So first we have, right, Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, and after him, we have Ribbi Eliezer HaGadol. I'm just going at the main character, or we'll call it the president of the court after Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, right, was Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. After him was Ribbi Eliezer HaGadol, the great. After him was Ribbi Akiva. And after Ribbi Akiva, he has 2 main students, Ribbi Ishmael and Ribbi Meir. Right? Ribbi Meir, actually they're both pretty well known, these 2 names. Anybody not familiar with the names Ribbi Meir or Ribbi Ishmael? This is also the Ribbi Meir, they refer to him sometimes as the Ribbi Meir Ba'al HaNes, or people also like visiting his grave a lot up north, Ribbi Meir, right? They made a lot of compilations on the oral Torah, which became the basis of the Mishnah. Ribbi Meir more so than anyone else, but Ribbi Ishmael also has the Mechilta of Ribbi Ishmael. He also has a lot of halachic midrashim, what they call midrashei halacha, that are a source for the Talmud and the Mishnah. Ribbi Meir ben Ger HaTzedek, so Ribbi Meir himself was also the son of a convert. Kiblu mi Ribbi Akiva, right? V'gam kibed, he was also the student. They were both students of Ribbi Akiva, although Ribbi Meir was very young at the time. V'gam kibel Ribbi Meir v'chaverav mi Ribbi Ishmael, right? So Ribbi Akiva, he has 2 students, Ribbi Ishmael and Ribbi Meir. Ribbi Meir, he's brilliant, but he's very young. And then after, Ribbi Meir becomes a student of Ribbi Ishmael, who was the elder student of Ribbi Akiva. So he received his Torah, his tradition, both from Ribbi Akiva and Ribbi Akiva's student, Ribbi Ishmael. All right, so Ribbi Akiva hayarosh yeshiva achar Rabban Gamliel. Right, so after the passing of Rabban Gamliel, Ribbi Akiva became the head. Rosh Yeshiva is basically the head of the court. Note that it's referred to as Sanhedrin over here. It's not referred to as a Sanhedrin, but as a yeshiva. And we'll see why soon. Vayu Havirav, Shimon ben Azai, Shimon ben Zoma, Ve'elisha Acher, Ribbi Tarfon, Ribbi Ishmael, Ribbi Yehuda ben Baba, Ribbi Yehuda ben Tema. Right, these are all other well-known Hachamim who presided, who were part of the court in the times of Ribbi Akiva. Sorry, did someone have a question? All right.
I actually have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
So you're mentioning Rabbi Akiva students. Am I wrong if because I have 2 names and I don't know if these are the same names that you're bringing up?
So
but,
I hear you very lightly. If you can,
You hear me very lightly? Is this
yeah,
better?
much better,
If
much better.
Okay, good. So you were talking about the students of Rabbi Akiva, and I'm not sure if these are the same persons because I'm not really. I might be like interpreting incorrectly. But there's a rabbi who's referred to. The only one in the Talmud is referred to Rabbi Yossi, and then another one is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai,
Right.
as known as the Raspi.
The Rashbi,
Are
right?
those the ones that you're talking about? No, it's complete. It's the other students.
Okay, so over here, we're mentioning other Chachamim that they weren't the students of Rabbi Akiva, but they were part of his generation, part of his court.
Okay.
Right. Previously, we were talking about Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Meir. Also, among them was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right, but his two more prominent students were Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Meir, because they also they were prolific writers. They wrote a lot, and thanks to them, really, we have the Mishnah and the Talmud.
Yeah. So another question: the difference between the Tanaim and the Sugot, because the Sugot were pairs, if I remember correctly. One was the Nasi, and one was more the ruler, or the religious. You please correct me if I'm wrong.
So,
I'm
one
wrong.
was like the president of the court. They were both part of the court. One was like the president of the court, and the other one was like the vice president of the court.
Okay. Were the Tanaim the same, that they were in pairs, like the Sugot?
So some people list them as two different periods, because the Zugot was a period of like 5 generations.
Yeah.
If you want to consider Tanaim, anyone who's mentioned in the Mishnah, then the Zugot are part of those Tanaim. If you want to look at it as a more historic perspective, as opposed to if they're mentioned in the Mishnah or not, then you would view it as two different eras.
Okay.
And as
So
when we spoke about the Zugot, we're talking about how one of the things that that represented that era was we transitioned from an era of 0 mahlukot, disputes, after the court's ruling, to a period where there was 1 dispute. And now we're going to see, or we may see it, maybe not now, but a little bit later on, that this is an era where there are many disputes among the Chachamim.
Okay. So how do you teach it? Do you teach from a historical perspective when it comes to the Sugot and Tanaim, or do you teach from like they are in the Mishnah, so therefore they are of the same generation?
I try to present.
It's just
both.
so I understand you and then follow you along.
I try to present both, because Sefer Kabbalah over here is gives more historical context to things, and it mentions the different generations and gives a lot more historical context. You get it that if Shira Gaon and the Mishnah Torah, they also don't really divide between the times of the Tanaim and the Zugot. What's important is to know what was significant about those different eras, because people do call it Kufat HaZugot, the times of the pairs. So whether they consider them Tanaim or not Tanaim, that's it's a different story. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Gave me a lot more.
What's
So
that?
I'm not gonna take up too much time. Let's get back to the lecture. You gave me a lot more, but let's get back to the lecture.
These are all good questions to understand. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva היה ראש ישיבה חרבן גמליאל, והיו חבריו שמעון בן עזאי ושמעון בן זומא, ואלישע אחר is also very well known, ורבי טרפון. Note that a lot of these are mentioned also in the Haggadah. We say there were 5 Hachamim that were sitting down with Rabbi Akiva, right? And היו מספרים ביציאת מצרים כל אותו הלילה, and they were telling stories of the Exodus the entire night until the students came and said it's time to say Kiryat Shema of Shaharit, right? So you have Rabbi Tarfon there and Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, right? ונקרא בן זומא ורבי חנינה בן תרדיון ורבי ישבב הסופר ורבי סימאי ורבי חוספית התורגמן כל אלה דור שני אחר החורבן. All these are second generation after the destruction of the temple. So one generation after the destruction of the temple, right, is, we say we went on from Rabban Gamliel, the times of the destruction, to Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, was part of the destruction, to Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol. That's the first generation after the destruction. Second generation is the generation of Rabbi Akiva and his friends. והיו בבבל בימיהם רבי יהודה בן בתרה וחבריו רבן יוחנן בן זכאי היה אלא שהאריך ימים הרבה. Right, and in his time there was in Bavel, the head of the yeshiva in Bavel was Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, and he was second generation after the destruction of the temple, but he was friends with Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, who was during the destruction of the temple, meaning he had a very long life. And in this time, right, second generation after the destruction, times of Rabbi Akiva, Amad Ehad Sheshmo Koziva, right? There was someone who stood, his name was Koziva, or they call him Ben Koziva, maybe it was his son, right? That actually wasn't his name, that was just the name that they gave him. It was kind of like a nickname. This is Bar Kochba. Bar Kochba means the son of a star. At the times of Rabbi Akiva, he was considered to be a star because he led this huge revolt against the Roman Empire, and for quite some time he was actually succeeding. And we'll see that. Koziva means false, meaning after the destruction and the failure of the revolt, he was renamed to Koziva, as someone who didn't live up to the hopes that he was selling. And he claimed to be the Mashiach ben David, and he's come to redeem the Jewish people, right? The truth is, it wasn't him who claimed it. It was all of the Hachamim at the time, Rabbi Akiva included. He was one of his greatest supporters. V'shalach yad b'melech Demastion, Melech Romi, right? And he set out to fight against the Roman Empire and the Roman king, that the head of Judea, the Roman official that's the head of Judea, V'harag Mishneu, and he killed his deputy, Shaya be'eretz Yisrael, right? The head of Judea, who was in Eretz Yisrael, he was the deputy, one of the deputies of the Caesar in Rome. V'Demastion melech Romi odenu na'ar, and this Demastian, he is still very young. He's a very young king. V'lo yitchazek lefanav, right? And he couldn't stand up to Bar Kochba. Umelech Koziva zeh haya bebetar shnat nun bet lechorban habayit. And this took place 52 years after the destruction of the second temple, right? How long was the first exile? How long between the destruction of the first temple to the construction of the second temple? It was 70 years. So now 50 years seems about right. Maybe it's time for our redemption. The previous one only took 70 years. Who would imagine that this one's going to last 2,000 years? So 50 years into the second exile, it seems like a good time to restore Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel. We've suffered enough, right? Apparently wrong. Umet b'malchuto, and he was king until he passed away in the middle of his reign, and he was succeeded umalach beno ushmo rofush, right? And he was succeeded by his own son, right? This looks like the reestablishment of a Jewish monarchy. Umed gamhu, and he also died. Umalach beno, and his son succeeded him. Ushmo Romulus, ונקבצו אל כוזיבה ובניו עם רב מישראל, ששבו מכל מקומותיהם. And word spread out. The truth is, Rabbi Akiva, he would travel the world to all the Jewish communities around Europe, and he would raise, within the Roman Empire, he would raise funds for Bar Kochba, and he would also recruit fighters to serve in Bar Kochba's army. And a lot of people came back to Eretz Israel during this time from all over the Roman Empire. Uvimei Romnus ben Rofus ben Koziva, right? So the grandson of Kochba, Hitchazek Andrianus ve'ala le'eretz Israel. Right? Then this next king in Rome, Andrianus, he says, enough is enough. It's time to put an end to this revolt. ולקח ביתר בתשעה באב עין ג' לחורבן הבית. And he came and he conquered the city of Betar, which was then the capital of the revolt, where Bar Kochba was the king. At the year 73, this is almost 20 years after the beginning of the revolt, after at least temporarily restoring Jewish sovereignty to parts of the land, and he completely destroyed Betar. V'harag et Romnus, and he killed Romnus, the grandson of Bar Kochba. V'hika b'Yisrael maka gidola, and he made a huge massacre among the Jewish people. V'lo nira'eta v'lo nishme'a lo b'mei Nebuzaradan v'lo b'mei Titus. Right, this kind of massacre was unprecedented, even compared to the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem itself. And this is considered to be one of the worst tragedies in back in that period, right? Even worse than the destruction of the temple, as far as how devastating this victory for the Romans was. Venisraf Rabbi Hanina bin Tiradion, and then they became really cruel, right? And they started massacring the Chachamim. Venisraf Rabbi Hanina bin Tiradion v'Sefer Torah imo, right? They burnt Rabbi Hanina bin Tiradion alive, holding a Sefer Torah. V'neherag Rabbi Yishba b'Sofer v'Rabbi Chotzpita Turgeman, right? These people who we mentioned as some of the great leaders of the court during the times of Rabbi Akiva, a lot of them were brutally killed. Rabbi Akiva himself was very brutally killed. ורבי יהודה בן בבא גם הוא נהרג, על שגזר מלך רומי גזרה שכל הנסמך יהרג וכל הסומך יהרג והעיר שסומכים בה תחרב. Right? So the Roman Empire, they wanted to put an end to the Semicha. Right? They see Rabbi Akiva, the president of the Sanhedrin, he is one of the biggest supporters of this revolt against the Roman Empire. And a lot of the Chachamim, leaders of the people, who were all Simuchim and all had a very strong authority throughout the Jewish communities, not just in Eretz Yisrael, but throughout the world, they wanted to put an end to their authority. And they said, anybody who is somech, remember we said semicha is one judge who has received semicha from someone who received his semicha, ordination, all the way back to Moses. He can be somech and ordinate another rabbi and appoint him to the court and give him the authorities of the Supreme Court, of the judge of the Supreme Court. So the Roman Empire wanted to put an end to this. And they said, anybody who is somech, who appoints a student to the Supreme Court, will be killed. And any student who is appointed will be killed. V'ha'ir shesomechin ba teharev, and any city that they do semicha in, that entire city will be destroyed. They're going to massacre everyone. והלך הוא, and so what he did, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, והלך הוא וישב בין שתי עיירות. So he found two very distant cities, and he tried to find the furthest place from each city, Ben Usha and Shfaram, right? Those are the two cities. V'samach hamisha zechinim, and over there he appointed five of his students, to become semuchim in the Supreme Court. Okay, so now he, according to the Roman Empire, he needs to be killed. His 5 students who we just ordained also need to be killed. However, there is no city they can really associate it with. So at least they spared the cities, trying to preserve the tradition, the oral tradition. V'neherag Rabbi Azar ben Shamua. Rabbi Azar ben Shamua was killed, was murdered. V'kodem lachen, but before that, sarku et bisaro shel Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef b'masrokot shel barzel. And this is the brutal murder of Rabbi Akiva, where they took metal combs and combed his skin, combed his flesh until he bled out to death. All these events happened in the times of Andrianus because of the revenge he wanted to take against Bar Kochba. Right, and this pasuk from Daniel refers to this era. Right, the Hachamim of the nation will be teaching the public. However, they will eventually, their downfall will be by the sword and by the flame, and be taken into captive, and for many days. So Rabbi Akiva masaret nafsho lamut. So Rabbi Akiva, he basically sacrificed his life for the preservation of the Torah. Acharei mot Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma, v'nerag Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion. And this other Chacham, Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion, who we said was one of the friends of Rabbi Akiva, he was also murdered. And so you have all the Chachamim are being targeted, and they're being murdered by the Roman Empire. And therefore, wisdom started to dwindle. Right? We had a period of great Chachamim, right, who were able to teach Torah and to have many students. Right? When we saw earlier that, I will see this now, that Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students before he appointed his next 5. Right, 24,000 students who were all killed in the battles, and then we have the heads of the courts are being targeted by the Roman Empire and tortured to death. So you don't have all these Hachamim anymore, and the ones that you have, they're fleeing for their life. Right, one of the famous ones, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Right, everyone knows the story of him studying Torah for 14 years in a cave, and that's supposedly when, he came up with his mysticism in the Zohar. Okay, the context of that wasn't what you may think, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was trying to disconnect from the material world, right, and meditate on his own and reach some sort of Uroka. That's not what happened, and it's pretty explicit in the Talmud that the whole reason why he went into the cave in the first place was because he was very, very outspoken against the Roman Empire, and they were looking to kill him. That's the reason why he went into hiding in the first place, and he had to hide there for 14 years. So all these Hachamim are now gone. They're being murdered or hiding. so that they don't get murdered. והעמיד רבי עקיבא תלמידים הרבה. Rabbi Akiva had many students. והייתה גזירה על התלמידים של רבי עקיבא. Over here reported as there was some sort of gezerah on the students of Rabbi Akiva. Gezerah could be, it was a shemad. It was the Roman Empire was going after the students of Rabbi Akiva, or possibly that the students of Rabbi Akiva were partaking in the actual armed conflict against the Roman Empire, which they ended up losing. אז הייתה סמיכה על התלמידים שניים של רבי עקיבא. So after Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students perished, Rabbi Akiva had a second batch of students, a much smaller batch of students. דאמרו, as they say, 12,000 תלמידים היו לרבי עקיבא, it's really 12,000 זוגים. He had 12,000 pairs of students of Rabbi Akiva. מגבעת ועד אנטיפטר, right? These are the boundaries of the land of Judah. וכולם מתו מפסח ועד הסרט. And they all died in this period of time between Pesach and Shavuot, right? And that is, we mentioned this before, the source for many of the mourning customs that we have during the times of Sefirat HaOmer was because of the deaths of the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva. It says, "V'haya ha'olam shamem," and the world was desolate. It was desolate physically because of the wars, but it was desolate spiritually because the Hachamim are all dying out, or being murdered, or being needing to flee for their lives. והיה העולם שמם והולך עד שבא אצל רבותינו בדרום ושנאה להם. Until Rabbi Akiva, right at this point, this is before he was murdered, he came down to the south and found a new batch of students to teach, and he taught them and appointed them as semuchim in the court. Rabbi Meir, who we mentioned before, right, as one of the main students of Rabbi Akiva, he was part of the second batch. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. This is the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He was part of the second batch of students of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, vehem ha'amidua be'ota sha'a kedeita bibamot. Right, and these students were the ones who restored the Torah to its place, right? As is mentioned in Tractate Yevamot in the Talmud. So the heads of the courts are being targeted, they're being murdered. The students of Rabbi Akiva are being massacred. The world is becoming desolate, both spiritually, mentally, and physically. And the Rabbi Akiva finds a new batch of students who could be the core to restore the Torah to its position. And these are the students who are responsible for the Mishnah and eventually the Talmud, and basically for Judaism as we know it today. This all comes from this new batch of students of Rabbi Akiva.
Wasn't it also Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi?
So Rabbi
Wasn't
Yehuda
it was
later. He comes from the students, later on students.
okay?
Here we'll get to that soon. Here, this is Rabbeinu HaKadosh or Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi.
No.
So Rabbi Meir, right? You said he was one of the younger students of Rabbi Akiva. Have gamir v'harif u'muhdad fe michulehon. Right? This is in Aramaic. He was brilliant. He was sharp, and he had more clarity than any of the other students. He was like the top genius student of Rabbi Akiva. Usmacho Rabbi Akiva, af ki odenu na'ar, and he's still very young. He's maybe a teenager at the time, and Rabbi Akiva appoints him as worthy to teach in the Supreme Court. Vehu samach gam Rabbi Meir, gam Rabbi Meir od pam, כמו שאמרו, right? And he also gave him semicha a second time. So even though he gave him semicha when he was young, he later on gave him semicha again after he grew up a bit more. As it said, as mentioned in Sanhedrin, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rab, Beram zachur oto ha'ish letova, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba shemo, she'ilmalehu batelu dinei kinasot be'Yisrael. Says, we remember in blessed memory Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, right? Because if it weren't for him, there'd be no more dinei kinasot, no more fines, or no more capital punishments, or anything that is within the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court alone. There are certain things that only a samuch, a beit din of semuchim can do. And if it weren't for this, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, there would be no semicha. And what did this Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba do? So as we read before, Shepam Ahad Gazam Malchut Arsha'a in Israel, right? Once the evil monarchy, meaning Rome, made a gezerah, shekol hasomech yahareg, anyone who gave semicha shall be killed. Kol hanismach yahareg, anybody who receives the semicha should be killed. Ve'ir shesomchim bo ya'aker, right? And any city that does semicha, practices a semicha, and it shall be uprooted. Ma'aseh Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, what did he do? As you mentioned before, he sat in between two distant towns, and he gave semicha to like 5 students. Ben Usha Shfaram, V'sham Samach Hamisha Zekinin, and over there he gave semicha to 5 students, to 5 elder students, and Rabbi Meir was one of them. Even though Rabbi Akiva already gave him semicha earlier, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. Smache Rabbi Akiva velo kibeluhu deyani kaveh. Right, Rabbi Akiva gave semicha to Rabbi Meir. However, it wasn't accepted on the rest of the Hachamim because he was still too young. They didn't want to accept him as part of the Supreme Court. He said you can't have a teenager as a presiding judge in the Supreme Court. And later on, when Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba gave him semicha a second time, at this point everybody accepted it. He's already proven himself as one of the more brilliant hachamim of his time, regardless of his young age. אז רבן גמליאל הזקן קיבל מרבן שמעון אביו. So Rabban Gamliel, we're going back to Rabban Gamliel at the beginning over here, right at the beginning of this chapter. He received Torah. We just want to talk now about his lineage. He received from Rabban Shimon Aviv, right? Beno shel Hillel, right? So he was a grandson of Hillel HaZaken. Remember Hillel and Shammai, that's already the last generation of the Zugot. And after Hillel was Rabban Shimon, and after Rabban Shimon was Rabban Gamliel HaZaken. And his son was Rabban Shimon Beno, was Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He received from him. I know it's confusing. As an exercise, I used to make my sons memorize the lineages of Rabban Gamliel and of the kings of Judah. It's good for your memory. If you can memorize it and remember who's who. Rabban Shimon Beno, this is Rashbag, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, received from Rabban Gamliel HaZaken. The Rabban Gamliel Beno, right, the son of this Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So his son Rabban Gamliel received Torah from him. So we have a tradition going down from father to son, and not just from teacher to student. And his son, Rabban Shimon Beno, the son of this Rabban Gamliel, he received Torah from him. And his son was Rabbi Yehuda. right? It starts with Hillel, then it goes to Rabban Shimon, and then Rabban Gamliel ben Shimon, and then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and then Rabban Gamliel ben Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and then Rabban Shimon, the son of that Rabban Gamliel, and then his son is no longer Shimon or Gamliel, his son is Rabbi Yehuda. And this is the Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, known as Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rabbi Yehuda beno shel Rabban Shimon, zehu hanikra Rabbeinu HaKadosh. This is what we refer to as our holy rabbi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, also known as Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and he is the composer of the Mishnah. Vehu kibel me'aviv, right? He received from this lineage. And also, Rabbi Azar ben Shamua, Rabbi Shimon Havero. This is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So who did he receive from? So we had the first era. There were no mahlokot between anybody. And then we move on to the era of the Zugot. All right? The era of the Zugot, there's one mahloket until we get to the end of the Zugot. And basically, there's kind of like two different traditions developing in parallel to each other. Okay, so we have those who say we do Semichan Yom Tov, and those who say we don't do Semichan Yom Tov. And then we reach Hillel and Shammai. And Hillel and Shammai, on top of that one mahloket, they have two more mahlokot. And then we enter a phase, a time where there's terrible massacres and terrible persecution of the Jewish people, especially the Hachamim. And during this time, we say the wisdom is going and dwindling, and this is also the time where the disputes are going and intensifying between the Hachamim. And we'll see later what contributed to that most was the persecutions themselves. Okay? And then at the end of this time, we have this whole lineage, right, which is completely goes through that whole time until we reach the end of that time. We have Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who receives Torah both from the lineage of the president and of his parallel, his counterpart, the vice president, right? We have on one hand the lineage of Hillel going down to Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Gamliel until Rabbeinu HaKadosh. And then we have the lineage of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and his student Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, and at the end, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So he was a student of both traditions. And this set the stage for really composing like the Mishnah, which could now be accepted among the entire nation. And what he did in the Mishnah is he didn't eradicate any of the disputes. He included all of them in the Mishnah so that nobody could come later and say, okay, well, the Mishnah says this, so-and-so, but we have a tradition, right? Because we come from a different lineage. We have a tradition that this should be the halacha. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi could say, with all the respect, I know this tradition and I know this tradition, right? I'm well versed in both. I received Torah from both. I received both traditions, and now we can finally settle the disputes. And that's basically what he went on to do in the Mishnah. And that is also the significance of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and that is also one of the main authorities of the Mishnah. That's why the Mishnah is so authoritative, because it incorporates two traditions that were developing in parallel to each other. I don't think we're going to start this next section. We'll save it for next time. She actually talks about the composing of the Mishnah and how it was done. Okay, so we'll end the lecture part here, and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. For anything that wasn't clear that you'd like me to repeat. Anything?
Last time it was said that 24,000
Students of Rabbi Akiva.
Were dead because they didn't respect each other, and it was a plague. And today, which I am more happy and it is more acceptable for me, that they died in this battle with Bar Kochba.
Right. So whenever the Hachamim give like a reason to a big tragedy, it's not the direct reason. It's more like a spiritual reason. For instance, they say, why was the second temple destroyed? They say because of Sinat Hinam. Okay, so how was it destroyed? Or what were the historical circumstances that led to that? All right, it was because we were conquered by the Romans. Basically, what the Chachamim are saying, why were they deserving of the destruction of the temple? It was because of Sinat Chinam. And so too with the first temple. Why was the first temple destroyed? They say because of three major sins: murder, shlichut damim, avodah zarah, and gilui arayot. Avodah zarah doing pagan practices, and gilui arayot is incest. Those were the things that led to the destruction of the first temple. Now, it's not that when people practiced that, the temple went up in flames, right? But those would be the reasons that that we were deserving of the temple being destroyed, but the actual cause, called the cause of death, not what led to it, was the conquest of Babylon, and later the conquest of Rome. And so too with the students of Rabbi Akiva, the Chachamim could say, because we don't really care from an educational perspective, from a perspective of how we can better ourselves, which is the number one agenda of the Hachamim. We don't really care what actually happened, bashetach, in the field. We want to know what we could have done, how we could have been better, so that we don't get into that situation to begin with. And they say it was because they didn't respect each other properly. Now, you could also go ahead and connect that to, find it as part of the chain of causality. If they didn't respect each other properly, then, maybe when they were fighting, there was like a disconnect in the chain of command. And that can cause chaos in the battlefield. And that ultimately is what led to them losing the war. Right? And you could say the same thing about the second temple. Why was it destroyed? They say because of Sinat Hinam. And the truth is that in the times of the second temple, the Jewish people were fragmented into many, many different cults. And they all had their own approach to dealing with the Romans. Some said we need to surrender, and others burnt down the food stock of the city of Jerusalem to force people to fight. And people weren't getting along. So you could say that led to the failure of the resisting the revolt against the Roman Empire. So when the Hachamim say what caused the destruction of the first temple, they're not going to say, the immediate cause. They want to say what we did wrong that eventually brought about one tragedy or another.
Wow, thank you very much. Now it's clear, very good. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Anything else? Anybody?
I have two questions. Well, there are actually a couple of more, but so the first question is dependent. I have two questions where one is dependent on the first. So
Okay.
if there is a
So we'll
question,
start with the first.
yeah. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is he the one who was in the cave together with his son, and then
Yes.
they were talking about his wife brought them food, and after a while they didn't want his wife to bring food because she could have disclosed their location?
I don't remember that part of the story.
Okay.
But yeah, he was in the
It's
cave
not really
for 2 years
important to
with
my
his
second
sons.
question. Yeah.
But it's possible, it makes sense. I don't remember that part of the story though.
No, it's not really important to the second question. It's just so I know that it's the right rabbi. So when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai came out of the cave with his son, from what I've read or from what I've heard, the first time they came out, everywhere they looked, they started fires. So they had to go back into the cave. And after they came back out of the 5 years again, one of them started fires wherever they looked, and the other one, I think it was the son, and then the father, wherever he looked, he calmed the fire, so to speak. So,
Right.
considering the last question, how this would be maybe a sort of a figure of speech, and how in that case, how would that
Absolutely,
be?
absolutely. So were you in the class on Tanuro Shel Achnai? Talking about the carob tree being uprooted and flying 100 amot?
That I don't remember. I'm sorry. If I missed it, I'm sorry.
I recommend you listen to the recording. I think you'll enjoy it based on your question.
Okay.
First of all, anything fantastic like that's brought in the Talmud, it's always a figure of speech, and it's never to be understood literally.
Of course.
Not only that, should it not be understood literally, but it's something that needs to be deeply examined. What is the meaning of them being 14 years or 7 years in the cave and then coming out, and everywhere they're looking, destroying cities, right? You could also try to examine it in light of what we learned today, of what was happening in that time, right? Any city that practiced semicha in it would be uprooted by the Roman Empire. So one possible interpretation could be that they finally left the cave. The Roman Empire is trying to hunt them down, and they hear, because maybe they have spies everywhere, or they're paying people to report on the Chachamim, and they hear a rumor that in the city, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is. So they go to the city and they try to find out from the people of the city, was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai here? And they're trying to smoke him out. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai sees that they're coming and destroying cities in search of him, and he says, you know what do I need this? Everywhere I go, they're chasing after me and massacring the people. I'll just go back into hiding. I'm not doing anybody any favors by leaving the cave. That is one possible interpretation. But it's definitely not that anywhere they looked, all of a sudden a fire came down from heaven and burnt them.
No, of course.
The only time that could be understood literally, where a fire came down from heaven and burnt it, is actually two places. We'll say Eliyahu in Har Carmel, because that was recorded as an explicit miracle in the Tanakh, and the sons of Aaron as their punishment for doing a foreign worship that God did not ask them to bring before him in the temple.
Okay.
But bottom line, any kind of supernatural, fantastic story that you would come across in the Talmud should always be examined and not taken literally.
So how, if you look at it in the reality, in a real world sense, and not
Again, sorry.
Allegory. I'm sorry. So if we look at the story, the portion of the story where the son, one of them, I don't remember if it's the son of the father, when one of them starts the fires and the other one calms the fires, how would that look if we look at it as not as an allegory, but as like you said, that the Romans were chasing them and they would destroy the cities. They would kill, like destroy the cities
Again,
if they suspected
what I said is a supposed interpretation.
Yes, of
It's
course.
not the answer. The only one who can give an answer to that question is you.
Oh.
Whole point of all these midrashim is to make you think, to make you break your head and find a suitable interpretation.
Oh.
All right, so that's
Yeah.
your homework for next week. I want to
Thank
hear your interpretation, what it means that one son would start the fire and the other one would put it out.
Okay. Can I have one more question?
It may cost you some more homework, but sure.
Oh. Right in exam season. So I was asking, you were talking about Rabbi Hanasi, Yehuda Hanasi. He he completed the Mishnah from all the notes and everything. And I heard that there was authority given in certain questions to one of the last of the Sugot, the Hillel and Shammai, Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. Is this true, and who?
What did you say? That what was given?
That some authority was given in some halachic questions for either Hillel or Shammai.
Right. It's true. We have one of the rulings in general is Hillel Shammai, Beit Hillel Beit Shammai, halacha kebeit Hillel. It was more acceptable on the Chachamim, the decrees or the decisions of Beit Hillel, and mostly, except for in 18 instances, when there's a dispute between Hillel and Shammai, halacha l'maaseh, we go according to Hillel.
Okay. Is there a reason why they go with Hillel over Shammai in such questions?
Yeah, it was more acceptable to everyone, and Hillel's Hillel's approach was a lot. We'll call it. It wasn't as stringent as Shammai. We have another rule that says koach dehetera adifa, right? He who has the power to permit something is preferable over someone who wants to forbid. Why? It's because when you're in doubt, you forbid. If you permit something, it's because you understand it deeply enough to say this is fine.
Okay.
So that's why we say koach dehetera adifa, right? So we always prefer he who is easier to permit something, and Hillel and Shammai. Hillel usually permitted things and was more lenient than Beit Shammai. Another thing is that we see with Hillel or Beit Hillel in general says Hazru lehorot ke Beit Shammai. There are places where there was a dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, and I think we'll discuss this later on as well, if I remember correctly, that Beit Shammai convinced Beit Hillel that they were right, and Beit Hillel had enough honesty to say, okay, we stand corrected, and we agree with Beit Shammai on this. And so that's another reason why they prefer the opinions of Beit Hillel over Beit Shammai. Because Beit Hillel, we know that if they think they're wrong, they'll say, sorry, I'm wrong, we'll do it your way.
So they were humble.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to know, is all the Zohar the same, or they got all different translation?
I'm sorry, is all the
The Zohar?
Zohar,
Yes.
is it all the same? I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Zohar.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks.
I don't recommend studying it anyways. There's enough to study beforehand before being ready to study Zohar.